Sonaris Percussion Podcast. My name is Greg Doscher, and this is episode 1. I want to use this episode to introduce the podcast, talk a little bit about what it's going to be and how it's maybe different from other percussion podcasts out there. Maybe give a little bit of background about myself and the brand in general. So this podcast is really an outgrowth of conversations that I've had with a lot of different people, from other instrument builders, marimba tuners, luthiers, like guitar makers, even harp makers, and other creatives in the field, just people that are kind of doing their own thing, they're entrepreneurs, and people that kind of, have their own brand, and are really just making moves and making strides in the art world. Just randomly, I've really struck up these conversations, like hours and hours with these people, and it's shed a lot of light. It's given me a lot of information just to think about. And I think that these kinds of conversations are perfect for this long form content because I do give a lot of information in my short form content, like on social media. But to do a longer form content, go more in depth is something that I'm really, really passionate about and really into. So that kind of brings me to the description of the podcast. I wrote that it's about in-depth conversations about instrument building, percussion entrepreneurship, and the wider musical world. On that first part, instrument building, I've heard from so many people, that when I talk about what I do and when I give my little, information, when I make my little social media posts about overtones, how to tune marimbas, or just characteristics of wood as a material, versus metal, or just really anything else, kind of the woodworking aspect of it. I get a lot of positive feedback. People are really excited to see that sort of thing because it's something that they haven't been exposed to a lot. And, there isn't a lot of information about that stuff out there. And so that brings me to a key word for my brand that I've really been focusing on, maybe not publicly, but in my mind, these past 2 years, which is accessibility. That's kind of where I got started, My goal was it was right before COVID, and my goal was to make a 5-octave marimba, kind of a practice marimba, and see if I can make it at a more affordable price than other people were doing, in an efficient way, selling it directly to consumers. It took a while, but I got there eventually. And it opened my mind to, again, that word, accessibility. I had that instrument, and it was, more accessible to people. But I thought, what are the other ways that accessibility is blocked in our field? And the 3 that came to mind were accessibility to instruments, accessibility to instruction. And what I mean by that is more of kind of virtual lessons, not so much, the 20-second social media post about how to hold mallets. I mean, that's fine. But really an in-depth and cohesive strategy for accessibility to instruction. And then the third one is accessibility to information. Now that last one, obviously social media helps a lot. I can talk about whatever I want, but like I said, this long form podcasting will really help me to fulfill that last pillar of accessibility to information. I want to do that because when I started, like I said, in 2019, late 2019, I started thinking about the idea of building a 5-octave. What's the first thing I did? I went online, how to build marimbas, how to tune, all this stuff. And there is definitely information out there. But I was kind of dissatisfied with it, especially from the woodworking aspect. I think as percussionists, no one out there is really talking about, from scratch, what tools do I need to start building anything? It doesn't have to be a marimba, but even if you just want to build, wooden planks for whatever piece you're doing. If you want to cut copper pipe and all this stuff. When you search about these things, or if you talk to other people about it, typically they'll give you responses with what they know, right? So copper piping, maybe it will be like a plumbing thing. And like, that's not what we're going for, right? Or for woodworking, it's about construction and furniture making and not tuning and all this stuff, right? So giving information about woodworking and just working with materials through the lens of a percussionist, I hope is really valuable to people out there that are, maybe interested in doing that sort of thing, or hopefully that sparks something in you to go out and start experimenting and manufacturing your own instruments. Which brings me to the next point, which is exactly that, kind of manufacturing your own instruments and taking control of your sound. Just taking control of your sound through building your own instruments. I think it's really scary for a lot of people to think about starting that, but once you actually start doing it, you start to see how the instruments that you play on are manufactured. It starts opening up your eyes and your ears to the instruments that you're playing on, and lets you make more, informed choices about what you're playing on. Because as percussionists, we're always thinking about how to control our sound, right? Like, what sticks am I using? What mallets am I using, of course, right? Like, am I using a soft or a hard mallet? But I think we just take our instruments for granted that, that's the way they sound, right? That's the way they sound, without really having something else to compare it to. So when you start making your own instruments, it really helps being able to have something to compare to. So all of that to say, the podcast will be, deep dives into topics like that. I kind of wrote out a lot of deep dives that I've done in my own research about this kind of stuff when I started building instruments. I kept asking the question, why, right? So, okay, rosewood is the most resonant wood. Okay, why? And then you learn, what goes into wood to make it resonant. Well, why is wood like that? And you just keep going deeper and deeper. So I've done these deep dives on my own, and it's something that I want to share in the podcast form. So some examples are kind of like the history of, rosewood, and how we used it in America, and also just tone woods in other cultures around the world. It's a very, very interesting story, and there's a lot to that. The other thing, kind of like I touched on before, viewing instruments from a manufacturer's perspective versus a regular consumer's perspective. So, one example of that might be like at the lumber yard, like I was talking about. The price of lumber is think about, is the price of lumber at a lumber yard reflective of its value to us as percussionists? Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't, right? An example is like walnut. Walnut is a very expensive wood for furniture making, solely because of the looks, and and some of the construction material aspects to it. But as percussionists, it's not it's not a resonant wood like we like it. So sometimes price of a raw material is not going to match the value that we give it as percussionists, because we are looking at it through a different lens. And that's something that I've had to learn and kind of realize through my journey. The other thing is almost touching back on the topic from a few minutes ago, the relationship of the performer and the composer and the audience over time, right? Since like 1600 till maybe 1800, composers and performers were almost the same person a lot of times, right? And then when you get into the Romantic era and into the modern times, it might shift a little more to the composer being their own person versus the performer. I think as percussionists, we're in a very unique field in that a lot of us are still like back in the day, performers and composers, and we're the audience. We're all in this together. And I want, instrument building could even be a part of that. You build your own instruments for your compositions and for your performances. And like I said, it really gives you a control over your sound. Another deep dive that I want to do is just, a regular kind of beginner's guide to instrument building in general, so that hopefully, someone listening is maybe not as scared to start doing that. Go out to Home Depot, just buy a handsaw for like $30, or go on Facebook Marketplace and buy a power tool for like $80. There's way too many power tools on Facebook Marketplace. There, you can get them dirt cheap. And that's all you need to just start experimenting on your own. And that's really what it's all about. Another deep dive could be kind of like independent manufacturing versus at-scale manufacturing. Maybe a deep dive on physics of percussion and the acoustic science that kind of goes into it. That's something that I've always loved learning about. Something else, characteristics of wood and metal and how it influences the sound. Okay, so if you have a piece of wood, if you increase the width, what happens, to the pitch? If you increase the length, what happens? If you increase the thickness, what happens? How does humidity affect, the sound? How does an oil-based finish versus a water-based finish affect the sound? Different harvesting methods, rough sawn versus quarter sawn. And I think that I can offer, a great perspective on this and use real world examples from my shop and bring them here and show everyone, in real time, how those things affect the sound. Another deep dive is there's a really great, story of how the marimba got to America and established, and especially how the tuning scheme kind of came about from kind of the 1870s until now. And that's a whole story and it's in and of itself. And obviously we'll talk about things like entrepreneurship, branding, marketing, and how we view art kind of as percussionists in our modern world, and especially with social media. And the last thing I wrote as a deep dive is kind of just a deep dive into how we can be more accessible as a percussion industry, and a percussion world. So those are kind of my deep dives, but the podcast won't only be about those deep dives. I want to have a mix of those, and then, like I said, interviews and those conversations that I've had with people in the field that will hopefully shed new light on maybe some things you haven't thought about. A little background about myself is that I grew up in the Texas, marching band scene in high school, and I was always a mallet kid. I always loved playing mallets, 2 mallets, 4 mallets, something that really, I got the bug basically in high school. But I didn't have anything to practice on at home, right? So I feel like we've all, experienced this, and we've all been there where you see the trumpet kid taking their instrument home and you don't have anything at home to practice on if you're a marimba player or a mallet player. And that always stuck with me. There were definitely products and solutions when I was growing up for that. And that was fine, and that always stuck with me when I went to college. So I did the whole college thing, and I caught another bug basically, which was teaching. I didn't go into school as an education major, but in the program we had, I was just so struck by what they were doing and what I was getting out of the program that I kind of switched my focus to becoming a public school teacher. And then after I graduated, that's exactly what I did. But I was also leading a marimba group at the time, right after I graduated. It was a Zimbabwean, or it still is, I'm still leading it. It's a Zimbabwean style, African style marimba band, where there's a choir of diatonic instruments. So there's soprano instruments, tenor instruments that are a little bigger, a baritone instrument, and a bass instrument. So we had been using these instruments since 2014. But in 2019, in the summer, the guy that built them out in Syracuse, he wanted them back. We were borrowing them. or he wanted us to pay for them, right? So that summer, we decided to try to start building our own instruments. We had a few people in the group that were woodworkers, that had woodworking experience, just a little woodworking experience. And I was tasked to make the keys. Now, we knew that the keys were made out of different woods. So some were made out of padauk, some were made out of ebony, and some were made out of even mahogany, like domestic woods, and cherry too. So the first thing I did, obviously, is I went to the lumber yard, and it was so lucky that this lumber yard had all these woods. And also what was really lucky was that this lumberyard had what are called cutoffs, which are exactly what they sound like. The piece that is cut off from the work piece, or the piece that you want to keep. So they had a bunch of these little small pieces of all these different woods: padauk, ebony, mahogany, cherry, and purple heart, and all this stuff, wenge. So I went to the lumberyard, with my mallets and sticks, and started playing them. And it really, really struck me how resonant these woods were, right? It opened my mind that it's really not just rosewood that is a resonant wood. Padauk, ebony, wenge, all these had their own little characteristics, but they sounded so good. They sounded like marimbas. And that got me started using padauk and seeing really how relatively cheap it was compared to how good it sounded. So eventually, I made these keys for these marimbas in the summer of 2019, but eventually we raised enough money to just buy the marimbas outright. So we didn't have to worry about building our own. Eventually we would actually build our own set of marimbas. But it got my mind wondering if I could use this padauk to build a 5-octave. So I was public school teaching at the time. Like I said, I got a little space for $200 a month for a year. So like the most I was out would be $2,400 for the year. And I just bought a chop saw, like a miter saw. That was the first tool I bought in 2019. And I just started cutting the wood, experimenting, trial and error, reading online how to do woodworking. Lots of trial and error, And eventually I made a marimba. It wasn't the best. I actually threw my first one out, started over again. Sold the second one. Used that to build a third one, on and on and on. And I finally gotten to the point where I finally feel like a business, right? I'm trying to expand my product line, trying to make other things. I'm working with other artists to make instruments for them, to make mallets for them. It's something that is really fulfilling and something that I want to share, and I want to show that you can do it too. And you can be an independent manufacturer and actually make it and actually be able to compete. And that is, again, kind of the purpose of this podcast. Just to show and share my story. Hopefully will inspire you or someone to start building yourself. And I think it's something that is very valuable and something that's very needed right now. Because a story that I like to tell myself, or that I like to think, is that, kind of in the 1900s when we first started, we all were building our own instruments. We all were building our own mallets because that's just what we did. Then in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, everything gets a little more homogenized, or maybe a little more corporatized, you could say. And now it's really kind of a global ecosystem. So it's really globally corporatized in that way. But I think the pendulum is swinging back in our field. We're starting to see a lot more independent manufacturers, a lot more people making their own niches, doing their own thing, and being successful with it. So I hope that this inspires you maybe to follow in suit, or at least follow along with my journey in trying to be successful in that way. If you want to follow me on social media, my Instagram is Sonaris Percussion. My TikTok is Sonaris Percussion. I usually really only use Instagram the most. I'm trying to do some more stuff on TikTok, but that's a whole nother story about how different each social media platform is. I'm going to start doing some more YouTube videos, some more video editing. So look out for a lot more content. And I have a lot of really exciting stuff coming up. So again, if you want to follow along, follow me on social media. Keep listening to the podcast. I'll have great interviews, great deep dives, and make sure to catch some of my live streams. I'm going to try to do some more of those. And I'll just be a little more active than I have been in the recent past. So if that interests you, keep listening. And until next time, take it easy.